I stood in the back corner of the ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, watching crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across Boston's elite. My mother, Victoria Collins, glided through the crowd in a gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her laughter bright and performative as she air-kissed women dripping in diamonds. The annual spring gala was her masterpiece, the event that cemented her position among Beacon Hill's upper crust. And I was the secret she worked tirelessly to keep hidden from this glittering world. My phone buzzed in my clutch. Another message from Steven Harper, my investor, confirming what I already knew. The acquisition had closed. $340 million. My medical technology platform, born from late nights in a cramped Dorchester apartment and fueled by desperation, had just made me wealthier than everyone in this room combined. The irony tasted bitter on my tongue. Victoria had spent years telling anyone who would listen that I was studying abroad, traveling, finding myself, anything to avoid admitting her daughter worked as a medical billing clerk in a community health center. She'd chosen her reputation over me so many times I'd stopped counting. But tonight, surrounded by the people whose approval she craved more than her own child's love, that choice was about to detonate in her carefully constructed face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started ordinarily enough, which somehow made it worse. I woke in my apartment above the convenience store on Dorchester Avenue, the sound of delivery trucks rattling the thin windows. Lily was already awake, her small voice calling from the bedroom we shared, asking for breakfast in that sweet, trusting way that simultaneously melted and broke my heart. She was 4 years old with curls that caught the morning light and questions that never seemed to end. Her father had left before she turned 2, dissolving into the kind of absence that felt deliberate, calculated. One day he was there, the next his closet was empty and my calls went straight to voicemail. I pulled myself from the narrow bed, my body aching from the double shift I'd worked at the medical billing office. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms that felt even smaller with Lily's toys scattered across every surface and my laptop perpetually open on the kitchen table. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Chun arguing with her grandson downstairs, their voices rising and falling in Cantonese. The radiator clanked and hissed, barely producing enough heat despite the February cold seeping through the window frames. This place was nothing like the Lewisburg Square townhouse where I'd grown up, with its soaring ceilings and imported furniture and staff who appeared silently to handle every inconvenience. Lily padded into the kitchen, dragging her stuffed rabbit by one ear, and I lifted her onto the chair that wobbled no matter how many times I tried to fix it. I poured cereal into the chipped bowl we'd bought at the dollar store, adding milk I'd stretched to last until payday. She ate slowly, telling me an elaborate story about the rabbit's adventures, and I nodded along while my mind raced through the day's impossible logistics. Daycare drop-off, commute to the billing office, 8 hours of processing medical claims while fielding calls from angry patients, pick up before the late fee kicked in, then home to attempt cooking something nutritious from whatever remained in our bare cupboards. My phone sat on the counter, screen dark and accusing. I hadn't called Victoria in 3 months. The last time we'd spoken, she'd been preparing for some museum fundraiser, her voice distracted and cool as she asked vague questions about my life. When I'd mentioned struggling with childcare costs, she'd gone silent for a long moment before suggesting I should have thought about that before having a child so young. The conversation had ended shortly after, both of us retreating to our respective corners. She didn't ask about Lily. She never asked about Lily. The rejection shouldn't have stung after all these years, but it did. Victoria had raised me in that Beacon Hill townhouse like I was a project to be perfected, an extension of her own ambitions. Private schools, violin lessons, cotillion classes, everything designed to mold me into the kind of daughter who would enhance her standing among Boston's old money families. But I'd made mistakes, at least in her eyes. I'd fallen for someone unsuitable, gotten pregnant too young, derailed the trajectory she'd mapped out so carefully. When I'd told her about the pregnancy, sitting in her formal living room with its antique furniture and oil paintings of ancestors who'd arrived on the Mayflower, she'd looked at me with something close to disgust. Her exact words still echoed in my memory, sharp and unforgiving. "You've embarrassed this family. You've thrown away every opportunity one gave you. Don't expect me to clean up your mess." She'd offered money for an abortion, And when I refused, she'd withdrawn completely. Not just emotionally but practically. No financial support, no childcare help, no acknowledgement that Lily even existed. To Victoria's social circle, I'd simply vanished, pursuing some vague adventure overseas that she referenced in passing when pressed. The truth that her daughter was raising a child alone in a rundown Dorchester apartment, working a dead-end job with no prospects, would have been unthinkable. I finished getting Lily ready, bundling her into the winter coat I'd found at a thrift store, and the boots that were already getting too small. We walked 3 blocks to the daycare, Lily chattering about the snowbanks and the pigeons and the bus that rumbled past. The daycare was licensed but barely, operating out of a converted house with peeling paint and a yard that turned to mud every spring. But Miss Angela was kind, and Lily seemed happy there, which was more than I could ask for given what I could afford to pay. I signed her in, kissed her forehead, and promised to be back before dinner. The commute to the medical billing office took nearly an hour, 2 buses and a stretch of walking that left my feet numb by the time I arrived. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, with fluorescent lights that hummed constantly and ventilation that never quite cleared the smell of microwaved lunches. My cubicle was one of dozens, each person hunched over their computer entering insurance codes and calling patients about outstanding balances. It was mind-numbing work, the kind that required just enough attention to be draining but not enough to be engaging. My supervisor, a perpetually stressed woman named Karen who ate lunch at her desk and never seemed to leave before 7, had called me into her office within an hour of my arrival. She sat behind a desk, piled with papers, her expression tight with the particular kind of frustration that came from managing a department on a shoestring budget. "Amanda, we need to talk about your hours. You've been leaving exactly at 5 for the past 2 weeks. I nodded, keeping my face neutral even as my stomach dropped. "I have childcare pickup. The contract says my hours are 9 to 5. She sighed, and I could see her weighing her words. "I understand that, but we're understaffed and the work isn't getting done. I need team players here, people willing to go the extra mile. Can you arrange alternative pickup?" The answer was no, of course. Alternative pickup costs money I didn't have, and the daycare charged $1 per minute for late arrivals, fees that added up faster than I could manage. But I couldn't say that without sounding like I was making excuses, so I just nodded vaguely and promised to see what I could do. Karen dismissed me with a look that suggested my job security was already on thin ice, and I returned to my cubicle feeling the walls close in a little tighter. Lunch came and went in a blur. I ate the peanut butter sandwich I'd packed that morning, the bread slightly stale because I'd waited too long between grocery trips. Around me, coworkers complained about their own struggles, bills and broken cars and family drama, that all sounded exhausting and familiar. I stayed quiet, unwilling to add my problems to the collective pool of misery. Talking about it wouldn't change anything. It would just make the reality more concrete, harder to ignore. By 3 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from the daycare. Lily had a fever. Not high enough to be alarming, but enough that they couldn't keep her for the rest of the day. I stared at the message, my chest tightening with a panic that had become almost routine. Leaving early meant facing Karen's disapproval again, possibly jeopardizing my already precarious position. But leaving Lily sick at daycare wasn't an option. I grabbed my coat and bag, stopped briefly at Karen's office to mutter something about a family emergency, and left before she could respond. The commute back felt longer, every delay amplifying my anxiety. By the time I reached the daycare, Lily was curled on a cot in the sick room, her face flushed and her eyes glassy. Miss Angela handed me a thermometer reading and suggested I take her to a doctor if it got worse. I nodded, knowing that a doctor's visit meant copays I couldn't afford and hours lost from work I couldn't spare. I carried Lily home, her small body heavy against my shoulder, and settled her on the couch with a damp cloth on her forehead. The afternoon dissolved into a fog of fever checks and cartoon episodes, Lily dozing fitfully while I tried to catch up on emails from my phone. Karen had sent a terse message reminding me that unscheduled absences required documentation, and I stared at it with a kind of numb resignation. Documentation meant doctor's visits, which meant money and time, both of which I had in desperately short supply. The apartment felt even smaller with Lily sick, the walls pressing in as I cycled through worst-case scenarios. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What if she got sicker? What if I lost my job? What if we couldn't make rent next month? Evening came, and with it the realization that I'd forgotten to buy groceries. The cupboards held pasta and a jar of sauce that was mostly empty, so I made that, portioning most of it onto Lily's plate even though she barely touched it. I ate what remained standing at the counter, too tired to sit, while Lily asked for her father in a small, confused voice. "He's not here, sweetheart," I said gently, because what else could I say? That he'd chosen to leave us, that he'd decided fatherhood was too inconvenient, that we apparently weren't worth staying for? Those truths were too heavy for a 4-year-old, so I deflected with promises of cartoons and stories, anything to distract her from the absence that shadowed our lives. Night fell, and I got Lily into bed, reading her favorite book twice before she finally drifted off. I sat in the kitchen afterward, my laptop open to the medical billing reports I was supposed to complete, but my mind kept circling back to Victoria. I thought about the townhouse on Louisburg Square, the one I'd grown up in, with its guest rooms that stayed perpetually empty and its kitchen stocked with food that sometimes went to waste. I thought about Victoria's charity work, the galas and fundraisers where she wrote checks for causes she cared about in theory but never touched in practice. And I thought about how she'd looked at me when I'd asked for help, like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. The rejection had been absolute. Not just a refusal to provide money, though that had stung, but a refusal to acknowledge Lily's existence. Victoria had grandparent friends whose Instagram feeds were full of pictures with their grandchildren, women who babysat and attended school plays and bought thoughtful gifts. But for Lily there was nothing. No birthday cards, no Christmas presents, no phone calls asking how she was doing. Victoria had erased us from her life as thoroughly as if we'd never existed, protecting her reputation from the scandal of a daughter who'd failed to live up to expectations. I closed the laptop without finishing the reports. Tomorrow would bring its own problems, its own impossible demands. For tonight I needed to sleep, to shut down the spiral of worry that threatened to consume me. I checked on Lily one more time, her fever finally breaking, her breathing steady and soft. She looked peaceful in sleep, innocent of the struggles that surrounded her. I wanted to give her more than this, more than a cramped apartment and thrift store clothes, and a mother who was constantly exhausted. But wanting wasn't enough. It never had been. The following week brought a cold that settled into my bones and refused to leave. Lily's fever had passed, but mine lingered, making every task feel like I was moving through water. I dragged myself to work each morning, swallowing over-the-counter pain relievers and hoping Karen wouldn't notice the way I leaned against my desk for support. The fluorescent lights felt too bright, the constant ringing of phones too loud, and the endless stream of insurance codes blurred together on my screen until I had to close my eyes and count to 10 just to refocus. Frank Morrison noticed first. He worked in the IT department, a quiet man in his 50s who'd been with the company longer than anyone could remember. He fixed computers and reset passwords without complaint, moving through the office like a ghost most people barely acknowledged. But he saw things, noticed details others missed. On Tuesday afternoon, when I'd been staring at the same claim for 15 minutes without processing it, he appeared beside my cubicle with a cup of tea and a granola bar from the vending machine. "You look like you could use this," he said simply, setting both on my desk before I could protest. His voice was rough from years of smoking, but his eyes were kind. I started to thank him, to insist I was fine, but he just shook his head. "Don't argue. Drink the tea. Eat something. You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Then he was gone, back to whatever server issue had brought him to our floor, leaving me staring at the unexpected kindness like it was something foreign. I drank the tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into my chest, and realized I couldn't remember the last time someone at work had done something for me without expecting anything in return. The office ran on a currency of favors and obligations, everyone constantly calculating what they owed and what they were owed. But Frank's gesture felt different, uncomplicated by ulterior motives. It was such a small thing, tea and a granola bar, but it cracked something open inside me that I'd been keeping carefully sealed. By Wednesday, my cold had worsened enough that I couldn't hide it anymore. Karen called me into her office again, her expression hovering between concern and irritation. "Amanda, you're clearly sick. You should go home." I nodded, grateful for the dismissal but terrified of the lost hours. Going home meant no pay, and no pay meant choosing between rent and groceries, between electricity and Lily's winter coat that desperately needed replacing. But I couldn't argue with Karen's assessment. My reflection in the bathroom mirror that morning had shown someone pale and hollow-eyed, barely recognizable. I gathered my things and left, the February wind cutting through my inadequate jacket as I waited for the bus. The ride back to Dorchester felt interminable, each stop adding minutes that stretched and warped. By the time I climbed the stairs to my apartment, my legs were shaking with exhaustion. I collapsed on the couch without even removing my shoes, pulling the thin blanket over myself and surrendering to the fever that had been building all day. Sleep came in fragmented pieces, dreams mixing with reality until I couldn't distinguish between them. I dreamed of Victoria's townhouse, of walking through rooms that grew larger and emptier with each step. I dreamed of Lily asking questions I couldn't answer, her voice echoing in spaces I couldn't escape. I dreamed of drowning in paperwork, insurance codes multiplying across every surface until they covered the walls and ceiling and floor. When I woke, the apartment was dark and my phone showed it was past 6. Panic jolted through me. Lily. I'd forgotten to pick up Lily. I tried to sit up, my head spinning, and fumbled for my phone with hands that felt clumsy and disconnected. 5 missed calls from the daycare. 3 voicemails. I played the first one, Miss Angela's voice calm but concerned. Amanda, it's 5:30 and you haven't picked up Lily yet. Please call us back. The second message at 5:45 had a sharper edge. We close at 6 and we haven't been able to reach you. We need you to pick up your daughter. The third message made my stomach drop. It's 6:15 and we still haven't heard from you. If we can't reach a guardian, we'll have to call social services. I was already moving, shoving my feet into shoes and grabbing my coat, my body protesting every motion. The stairs down to the street felt impossible, each step requiring concentration I barely had. The evening air hit me like a wall, cold and unforgiving, and I realized I had no way to get there quickly. The buses ran less frequently after 6, and a taxi would cost money I'd already allocated for other necessities. I started walking, then jogging despite the way it made my lungs burn, covering the blocks between my apartment and the daycare with a desperation that overrode physical discomfort. By the time I reached the converted house, it was nearly 7. Miss Angela stood in the doorway with Lily beside her, the little girl's face tear-streaked and confused. Miss Angela's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that communicated disappointment more effectively than anger. Amanda, we need to talk. I nodded, breathless and dizzy, and reached for Lily. She buried her face against my shoulder, her small body trembling, and guilt crashed over me in waves. Miss Angela ushered us inside, closing the door against the cold. This is the 3rd time this month you've been late, and today you were over an hour past closing. I understand you're managing a lot, but we have policies for a reason. If this happens again, I'll have to report it. Her words were measured, professional, but I could hear the genuine concern beneath them. Is everything all right at home? Are you getting the support you need? The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to unpack. I wanted to tell her the truth, that nothing was all right, that I was drowning in obligations and expenses and expectations I couldn't meet. But admitting that felt like admitting failure, like confirming every doubt Victoria had ever expressed about my ability to handle motherhood. So I lied. Everything's fine. I've just been sick. It won't happen again. Miss Angela studied me for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but she let it drop. Please make sure it doesn't. I care about Lily, but I have to think about all the children here. I carried Lily home, her weight familiar and grounding against my chest. She'd stopped crying but remained quiet, her silence somehow worse than tears. Back in the apartment, I made her dinner from the dwindling supplies in the cupboard, crackers and cheese and an apple one cut into careful slices. She ate without enthusiasm, watching me with those wide, perceptive eyes that seemed to see more than a 4-year-old should. Mama, are you sad? The question caught me off guard, and I had to swallow hard before answering. Just tired, sweetheart. But I'm okay. She nodded, accepting the deflection because she had no choice, and I felt the weight of that acceptance like a stone in my chest. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and forced myself to face reality. My bank account showed a balance that wouldn't cover next month's rent, let alone groceries, utilities, and daycare. The medical billing job paid barely above minimum wage. And between the cost of living in Boston and the expenses of raising a child alone, I was falling further behind every week. I'd been ignoring the mounting debt, the credit card statements I shoved in a drawer unopened, the calls from collection agencies I let go to voicemail. But ignoring problems didn't make them disappear. It just made them grow. I opened a spreadsheet and started listing everything. Rent $1,200. Daycare $800. Utilities, groceries, transportation another $600 combined. Medical bills from Lily's last checkup still unpaid. The winter coat she needed. The shoes that were already too small. Every line item felt like another brick in a wall I couldn't climb. My monthly income barely cleared $2,000 after taxes, leaving me short by hundreds of dollars that I'd been covering. With credit cards and borrowed time, the laptop screen blurred as tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. I was 26 years old, living in a neighborhood where gunshots occasionally punctuated the night, working a job with no prospects for advancement, raising a child whose father had abandoned us and whose grandmother refused to acknowledge her existence. This wasn't how my life was supposed to unfold. Victoria had raised me in privilege with opportunities most people only dreamed of. Private schools, family connections, a trust fund that was supposed to support me through college and beyond. But when I'd gotten pregnant, when I'd refused to terminate like she demanded, she'd cut me off completely. The trust fund was frozen, access denied until I came to my senses, which apparently meant abandoning my daughter. I thought about calling her. My phone sat on the table, Victoria's number still saved in my contacts despite the months of silence. Part of me imagined she might have softened, that time and distance might have given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized that Lily was her grandchild. That family should matter more than reputation. Maybe she'd offer help, not out of obligation but out of genuine care. The fantasy was appealing enough that I almost dialed, my finger hovering over her name. But then I remembered the last conversation. Her voice cold and dismissive. You made your choice, Amanda. Now live with it. I remembered the way she'd looked at me when I told her about the pregnancy, like I was something shameful, an embarrassment to be hidden. I remembered every time she prioritized her social calendar over my childhood needs. Every parent-teacher conference she'd missed. Every recital where I'd searched the audience for her face and found only empty seats. Victoria had never been the mother I needed. Asking her for help now would just give her another opportunity to confirm what she already believed, that I was a disappointment incapable of managing my own life. I closed the laptop and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The ceiling fan clicked rhythmically overhead, the sound marking seconds that accumulated into minutes into hours. My mind spun through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. I could ask for more hours at work, except Karen had already made it clear my schedule was a problem. I could look for a second job, except I barely managed the one I had with Lily's needs. I could move somewhere cheaper, except moving required deposits and fees I couldn't afford. And cheaper meant further from the daycare and my job and the few supports I'd managed to cobble together. The next morning arrived too quickly, dragging me from shallow sleep into another day I wasn't prepared to face. Lily needed breakfast, the apartment needed cleaning, and I needed to get us both out the door before we were late again. I moved through the routines mechanically, my body operating on autopilot, while my mind remained stuck in the calculations from the night before. The numbers didn't work. No matter how I rearranged them, how I cut corners or delayed payments, the numbers simply didn't work. At the office, Frank appeared at my cubicle again mid-morning, this time with a printout of job listings. He set it down without comment, but when I looked up at him confused, he just shrugged. Saw these yesterday. Thought they might interest you. Then he walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at the pages. The listings were all for positions that paid more than my current job, mostly in medical billing and coding, but for companies that offered better benefits and salaries. Some were even remote, which would solve the daycare pickup problem. I folded the papers carefully and tucked them into my bag, oddly touched by Frank's quiet intervention. He didn't know my full situation, couldn't possibly understand the extent of my struggles, but he'd noticed enough to offer help in the only way he knew how. It was more than most people did. More than anyone in my family had done. During my lunch break, I walked to the public library a few blocks from the office. The building was old but well maintained, with high ceilings and wooden tables that had absorbed decades of use. I found a quiet corner and pulled out my laptop, connecting to the free Wi-Fi and opening the job listings Frank had given me. Most required qualifications I didn't quite have, certifications I couldn't afford to pursue. But a few seemed possible, positions that valued experience over credentials. I started drafting applications, tailoring my resume to highlight the skills I'd developed in my current role. It felt simultaneously hopeful and futile, like throwing messages in bottles into an ocean that stretched endlessly in all directions. But doing something felt better than doing nothing, better than sitting in paralysis while circumstances tightened around me. By the time I returned to the office, I'd submitted applications to 5 companies and bookmarked 3 more to finish later. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Karen caught me as I was settling back into my cubicle, her expression serious. "Amanda, can we talk?" I followed her to her office, my stomach knotting with anticipation. She closed the door and gestured for me to sit, her movements deliberate. "I'll get straight to the point. Your performance has been slipping, and your attendance is becoming a problem. I understand you have personal obligations, but this job requires consistency. I need to know if you're committed to being here." The question felt like a trap, every answer fraught with potential consequences. If I admitted the truth, that my commitment was limited by single parenthood and poverty and circumstances beyond my control, she'd likely start looking for my replacement. If I lied and promised unwavering dedication, I'd be setting myself up for failure when the next inevitable crisis hit. So I tried for something in between, something honest enough to be credible but vague enough to avoid damning myself. "I'm doing my best with the resources I have. I understand the job requirements, and I'm working to meet them. If there are specific areas where my performance is lacking, I'm open to feedback." Karen sighed, and for a moment her professional facade cracked to reveal genuine weariness. "Look, I like you, Amanda. You're smart and capable when you're here. But I'm managing a department that's understaffed and over budget, and I need people I can rely on. I can't keep making exceptions." She paused, weighing her next words. "I'm putting you on a performance improvement plan. 30 days to show consistent attendance and output. Things don't improve, I'll have to let you go." The words landed like blows, each one precise and devastating. A performance improvement plan was essentially a countdown to termination, a formal process that documented failure and justified dismissal. 30 days to somehow solve problems that had been building for years, to magically transform circumstances that were fundamentally untenable. I nodded numbly, accepting the paperwork Karen slid across the desk, and returned to my cubicle feeling like the walls were finally closing in completely. Frank was at his desk when I passed the IT section, and something in my expression must have given me away because he looked up sharply. "You okay?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice, and kept walking. But his concern followed me, a small bright point in the gathering darkness, reminding me that even in the worst moments, there were still people who noticed, who cared, even if they couldn't fix anything. That evening I picked up Lily on time, making a conscious effort to arrive with minutes to spare. Miss Angela smiled at me, the tension from the previous day eased slightly, and Lily chattered happily about the picture she'd painted. We walked home through streets that were starting to show signs of spring, snow melting into gray slush and early crocuses pushing through the dirt. Lily pointed at everything, narrating the world around us with 4-year-old enthusiasm, and I tried to match her energy, tried to be present instead of lost in worry. At home I made dinner while Lily played, her laughter drifting from the living room like a lifeline. I held on to that sound, let it anchor me when my thoughts started spiraling toward worst-case scenarios. Whatever happened with work, whatever financial disasters loomed, I had to keep moving forward. For her. Because she deserved better than a mother who gave up, better than another abandonment to add to the one she'd already experienced. After dinner, after bath time and stories and the lengthy process of getting a 4-year-old to sleep, I returned to my laptop and the job applications. I finished 3 more, forcing myself to write cover letters that sounded confident and capable, that painted a picture of someone who had their life together. It felt like lying, but it was also necessary. No company wanted to hire someone who admitted to barely holding on. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a spam message, but something made me open it. "Amanda, this is Rachel Davis. Frank Morrison gave me your contact information. I run a medical coding training program, And he mentioned you might be interested in certification courses. I'd like to talk if you have time. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure I'd understood correctly. Frank had reached out to someone on my behalf, had taken my situation seriously enough to connect me with resources I didn't know existed. I responded immediately before I could overthink it. Yes, I'm very interested. When would be a good time to talk? The reply came within minutes. Tomorrow afternoon? I can meet you at the library on Boylston if that works. I confirmed the time and location, then sat back, something like hope flickering uncertainly in my chest. That night, I lay in bed listening to Lily's soft breathing from the next room and thought about all the ways life could change. About how Frank's small acts of kindness had opened a door I hadn't known was there. About how Victoria's rejection, painful as it was, had forced me to build supports elsewhere, with people who didn't share my blood but who showed up anyway. About how hitting bottom sometimes meant there was nowhere to go but up. The hope was fragile, easily crushed by reality's weight. But it was there, undeniable, a tiny flame I needed to protect and nurture. Because without it there was nothing. And I'd already lost too much to give up the one thing keeping me moving forward. I met Rachel Davis at the library on a Thursday afternoon, arriving 15 minutes early because lateness felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. The reading room was quiet, filled with students hunched over textbooks and retirees browsing newspapers. I found a table near the back, away from the main traffic, and tried to calm the nervous energy that had been building since her text. My hands kept fidgeting with my phone, checking the time, smoothing my hair, adjusting the collar of the blouse I'd ironed specifically for this meeting. Rachel arrived exactly on time, a woman in her early 40s with gray-streaked hair pulled into a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She wore jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, carrying a worn leather bag that she set on the table between us. "Amanda?" I nodded, half standing to shake her hand, and she waved me back down. "No need for formality. Frank told me you're working in medical billing and looking for ways to advance. Tell me about your situation." The directness caught me off guard. I'd expected small talk, the usual dance of professional introduction before getting to substance. But Rachel seemed to operate on a different frequency, one that valued efficiency over social convention. So I told her, leaving out the most painful details but giving her enough to understand. The medical billing job that barely paid enough to survive. The single parenthood. The performance improvement plan hanging over my head like a guillotine. The need for something better, something that could actually support my daughter and give us stability. Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but her attention complete. When I finished, she nodded once, processing. Medical coding certification could triple your income. Maybe more if you specialize. The training takes about 6 months if you're dedicated, and most of it can be done remotely on your own schedule. I run evening and weekend classes for people who can't do traditional programs. The cost is usually $3,000, but I have scholarships for single parents. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million given my current financial state. But the mention of scholarship sent a jolt of possibility through me. What would the scholarship require? Rachel pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. An application, 2 references, and an essay about why you want to pursue certification. The program is competitive, but Frank vouched for you, and his word carries weight with me. He doesn't recommend people lightly. I opened the folder, scanning the paperwork inside. The application was straightforward, asking for employment history and education background. The essay prompt asked applicants to describe their goals and how certification would change their lives. I could write that in my sleep, had been living that answer for years. When would I need to submit this? Rachel checked her phone. Applications are due in 2 weeks. I'll make decisions by the end of the month, and the next cohort starts in April. If you're accepted, classes meet Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 6 to 9, plus online modules you complete at your own pace. The timeline felt both impossibly tight and achingly distant. 2 weeks to pull together an application while managing work and Lily and the constant low-level crisis that defined my existence. Then potentially months of waiting, of hoping while nothing changed. But it was something concrete, a path forward that didn't rely on luck or circumstance. I met Rachel's eyes, trying to convey gratitude I didn't have adequate words for. "Thank you for considering me." I'll get the application in as soon as possible. Rachel stood, shouldering her bag with practiced ease. Frank said you're a hard worker. That matters more than natural talent in this field. Medical coding requires attention to detail and persistence, both of which can be learned. She paused, her expression softening slightly. I was in your position once. Single mother, dead-end job, no clear way forward. Certification changed everything for me. I want to help others do the same. Then she was gone, weaving through the library tables toward the exit, leaving me alone with the folder and a fragile sense of possibility. I stayed at the library for another hour, reading through the application materials and making notes. The references would be straightforward enough. I could ask Karen, despite our strained relationship, and probably Miss Angela from the daycare. The essay felt more daunting, not because I lacked material, but because putting my struggles into words felt like exposing wounds I'd worked hard to keep covered. But if vulnerability was the price of opportunity, I'd pay it. That evening, after Lily was in bed, I opened my laptop and started writing. The words came slowly at first, halting and self-conscious, but gradually gained momentum. I wrote about growing up with privilege and losing it, about the isolation of single parenthood, about working a job that demanded everything and gave back barely enough to survive. I wrote about wanting better for my daughter, about refusing to let circumstances define our future. I wrote until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped, until the essay had transformed from an application requirement into something raw and more honest than I'd intended. I saved the document and closed my laptop, too emotionally drained to edit. That could wait for tomorrow for fresh eyes and clearer judgment. For tonight I'd done what I could, taken one more step toward something that might eventually lead somewhere better. The apartment was quiet except for the familiar sounds of the building settling, pipes creaking and neighbors moving overhead. I sat in that silence, letting exhaustion wash over me, and thought about how strange it was that hope could be both terrifying and necessary. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a haze of work, childcare, and application preparation. I asked Karen for a reference during a rare moment when she seemed approachable, catching her in the break room during lunch. She agreed with obvious reluctance, reminding me that the reference would have to be honest about my recent performance issues. I assured her I understood, swallowing the humiliation that came with asking for help from someone who was actively documenting my failures. Miss Angela was more enthusiastic when I approached her at pickup one afternoon. Of course I'll write you a reference, she said warmly. You're doing your best in difficult circumstances, and Lily is a wonderful child. That speaks to your parenting. I blinked back unexpected tears at the kindness, at the reminder that not everyone saw my struggles as failures. Miss Angela squeezed my shoulder briefly. You're stronger than you think, Amanda. Don't forget that. I finished the essay over a weekend, editing and refining until every word felt essential. The final version was 2 pages of single-space text that traced my journey from privilege through abandonment to this moment of reaching for something better. I didn't shy away from the painful parts, the ways Victoria's rejection had shaped me, the nights I'd cried in the bathroom so Lily wouldn't hear. But I also emphasized resilience, the determination that kept me moving forward, even when every logical reason suggested giving up. Frank checked in periodically, stopping by my cubicle with coffee or granola bars, never asking directly about the application but clearly invested in the outcome. He'd fix my ancient laptop one afternoon when it started overheating, upgrading the RAM and cleaning out years of accumulated dust. You'll need this to run smoothly for the online modules, he'd said matter-of-factly, as if spending his lunch break repairing my computer was completely normal. I tried to thank him properly, but he just shrugged. Rachel helped me years ago when I was trying to career transition. This is how it works. We help each other. I submitted the application 2 days before the deadline, printing everything at the library and mailing it to the address Rachel had provided. The act of putting it in the mailbox felt both anticlimactic and momentous, a point of no return. Now there was nothing to do but wait and try to keep my regular life from imploding while the decision was being made. Work continued to be a minefield. Karen monitored my attendance obsessively, noting every minute I arrived after 9 or left before 5:30. The performance improvement plan required weekly check-ins where she reviewed my productivity metrics and pointed out areas of deficiency. I sat through these meetings with forced composure, agreeing to work harder, be better, somehow transcend the limitations of my circumstances through sheer willpower. It was theater, a performance we both knew would end in my termination, but we went through the motions anyway. My coworkers had started to notice the tension. Some avoided me, as if failure might be contagious. Others offered sympathy in passing, vague statements about how tough things were in hopes that it would get better. Only Frank remained consistently present, his quiet support unwavering even as my position became increasingly precarious. He never asked what Karen had said in our meetings, never pressed for details I wasn't ready to share. He just showed up day after day, a steady presence in chaos. Lily seemed to sense something was wrong, though I tried to shield her from the worst of it. She'd started having nightmares, waking in the middle of the night crying for reasons she couldn't articulate. I'd hold her in the darkness, rocking and humming until she calmed, my own anxiety mirroring hers. Children absorbed stress like sponges, picking up on tensions adults thought they were hiding. No matter how carefully I maintained normalcy during waking hours, she felt the undercurrents. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mama, why doesn't Grandma Victoria come visit us?" I froze, unprepared despite knowing this conversation would come eventually. How did you explain rejection to a 4-year-old? How did you tell your daughter that her grandmother chose reputation over relationship, that she valued social standing more than family? I took a breath, choosing words carefully. Grandma Victoria is very busy with her own life. It's not about you, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. But Lily wasn't satisfied with the deflection. Doesn't she want to meet me? The question pierced through every defense I'd built, exposing the wound that never quite healed. I pulled her closer, feeling her small heartbeat against my chest. I don't know what Grandma Victoria wants, but I know that you are loved and wanted and important, and nothing she does or doesn't do changes that. Lily nodded against my shoulder, accepting the answer because she trusted me, and I felt the weight of that trust like a responsibility I couldn't fail. March arrived with unpredictable weather, warm days followed by sudden snowstorms that left the streets glazed with ice. I slipped on the walk to the bus stop one morning, landing hard enough to bruise my hip and tear my only good pair of work pants. The physical pain was manageable, but the pants represented a loss I felt acutely. I couldn't afford to replace them, not with rent due and the electric bill higher than expected. So I patched them with iron-on mending tape and hoped no one would look too closely. Rachel's decision was supposed to come by the end of March, but the month wore on with no word. Every day I checked my email obsessively, my phone, the mailbox in the building lobby. Every day brought nothing, and the silence started to feel like its own form of rejection. Maybe I hadn't been good enough. Maybe Frank's recommendation wasn't as strong as I'd hoped. Maybe the essay had revealed too much vulnerability and not enough potential. By the last week of March, I'd convinced myself the answer was no. Rachel would have contacted me by now if it were good news. The delay could only mean she was trying to figure out how to let me down gently. I started bracing for disappointment, preparing for the reality that this door, like so many others, would remain closed. The performance improvement plan at work was nearing its end, and Karen had already started making comments about how the department might be restructured. The writing was on the wall. Then on the final day of March, a Friday that had started like any other, I found an envelope in my mailbox when I got home with Lily. The return address showed Rachel's training program, and my hands shook as I opened it. Lily tugged at my coat, asking about dinner, but I couldn't focus on anything except the letter inside. Dear Amanda, I'm pleased to inform you that you've been accepted into the medical coding certification program with a full scholarship. Your application demonstrated exactly the kind of determination and potential we look for in candidates. Classes begin April 10th. Please review the attached schedule and let me know if you have any questions. Congratulations and welcome to the program. Rachel Davis. I read it 3 times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood, that this wasn't some cruel mistake. Accepted. Full scholarship. Starting in 10 days. The news felt surreal, too good to be true after months of nothing but setbacks and closed doors. I sank onto the bottom stair of the building's entrance, Lily looking at me with confusion, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Mama? Lily touched my face, her small hand gentle. Are you crying? I realized. Tears streaming down my cheeks, but for once they weren't born from despair. I pulled her into a hug, squeezing maybe too tight, but she didn't complain. These are happy tears, sweetheart. Something really good just happened. She accepted this explanation with the flexibility of childhood, already moving on to more pressing concerns. Can we have mac and cheese for dinner? We climbed the stairs to our apartment, Lily chattering about her day while I tried to process what acceptance meant. 6 months of training, evening classes twice a week, online modules on my own time. It would be exhausting, adding coursework to an already impossible schedule. But it was also a path out, a way to eventually leave the medical billing job and Karen's performance reviews and the constant scramble to make rent. 6 months of difficulty in exchange for a future that didn't feel like drowning. That evening, after Lily was asleep, I called Frank. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff. Morrison. It's Amanda. I got accepted to Rachel's program. Full scholarship. There was a pause, then something that might have been a chuckle. That's good news. Real good. You deserve it. I felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the simple acknowledgement. Thank you for connecting me with her. For believing I could do this. Frank cleared his throat, uncomfortable with gratitude. Just pay it forward someday. Help someone else when you're on the other side. I promised I would, meaning it completely, and we said goodbye. I sat with my phone in my hand, thinking about who else to tell. Not Victoria. She'd forfeited the right to know about my victories when she'd chosen to ignore my struggles. Not Lily's father, who disappeared so completely, I didn't even have a current phone number. Just Frank and by extension Rachel and Miss Angela who'd written a reference. A small circle, but one built on genuine support rather than obligation. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Rachel had sent detailed information about the program, including a list of supplies I'd need and recommended textbooks. The books were expensive, even used, but she'd noted that the program had a lending library for students who couldn't afford to purchase. I added my name to the lending list without shame, past the point of pride getting in the way of practicality. Monday brought a meeting with Karen that I'd been dreading. The 30 days of the performance improvement plan had ended, and while my attendance had been perfect for the past 2 weeks, my overall productivity still fell short of her expectations. I sat across from her in the small office, waiting for the inevitable. Amanda, I've reviewed your performance over the past month, and while there's been some improvement, it's not enough to justify ending the improvement plan. I'm going to have to let you go. We'll pay you through the end of the week, and you'll receive information about unemployment benefits. The word should have devastated me, and part of me did feel the panic of lost income, lost stability, but another part felt almost relieved. The job had been barely sustainable even before the improvement plan, a constant source of stress that paid too little and demanded too much. Now I could focus entirely on the certification program without trying to balance impossible schedules. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing. I cleaned out my desk while Karen watched, packing the few personal items I'd accumulated into a cardboard box. My coworkers pretended not to notice, keeping their eyes on their screens as I carried my things past their cubicles. Only Frank acknowledged the departure, meeting me by the elevator. You're going to be fine, he said quietly. Better than fine. This job was holding you back anyway. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he handed me a slip of paper with his cell phone number. Call if you need anything. References, advice, whatever. You've got this. The elevator doors closed on his steady presence, and I descended to the street level, walking out into an afternoon that felt different somehow. The same buildings, the same traffic, the same cold wind cutting between skyscrapers. But I was different, unmoored from a job I'd hated and heading toward something unknown. Scary, yes, but also full of potential. I picked up Lily early from daycare, splurging on a taxi ride home because I didn't want to navigate the buses with my box of belongings. She was delighted by the unexpected early arrival, bouncing in the back seat and asking 100 questions. At home, I made her favorite dinner and let her stay up past bedtime, both of us deserving a night that felt special rather than another exercise in survival. After she finally fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and filed for unemployment. The benefits would be less than my paycheck had been, but combined with careful budgeting, they might be enough to get through the certification program. I'd have to cut expenses even further, eliminate anything remotely unnecessary. But I'd survived on less. I could do this. The acceptance letter from Rachel sat on the table, a tangible reminder of possibility. I read it again, letting the words sink in deeper. Determination and potential. That's what she'd seen in my application, in the essay I'd written while trying to balance honesty with hope. Not failure. Not disappointment. Potential. Maybe she was right. Maybe everything that had happened, all the rejection and struggle, had been building toward this moment. Not because suffering had inherent value, but because survival required developing strengths I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. I thought about Victoria, probably preparing for some spring gala in her Beacon Hill townhouse, surrounded by people who valued her for her family name and charitable donations. She had no idea what was happening in my life, the small victories and crushing defeats, the moments that were shaping me into someone stronger than the daughter she tried to mold. And that was fine. I didn't need her approval or acknowledgement. I'd found something more valuable, the certainty that I could build a life on my own terms, with people who showed up not out of obligation but because they genuinely cared. The apartment was quiet, just the familiar sounds of the building at night, and I let myself feel cautiously optimistic. The road ahead was still difficult, still uncertain. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed I might actually make it to somewhere better. The certification program started on a Tuesday evening in April, and I arrived at the community center where classes were held with a mixture of anticipation and terror. The building was older, with scuffed linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally, but the classroom Rachel had set up felt purposeful and organized. Desks arranged in a horseshoe, whiteboards covered with medical terminology, and shelves lined with reference materials that looked well used. About 15 other students filtered in, most of them women around my age, all wearing the same expression of nervous determination. Rachel stood at the front, sorting through papers, and looked up as I entered. "Amanda, glad you made it. Grab any seat." I chose a desk near the middle, not too eager in the front row but not hiding in the back either, and pulled out the notebook and pens I'd purchased at the dollar store. Other students were doing the same, unpacking laptops and tablets, and I felt a flash of inadequacy at my outdated supplies. But Rachel had said the lending library included access to computers for those who needed them, and I'd already put my name down. The class began promptly at 6, Rachel diving into introductions without preamble. "This program is intensive and demanding. You'll learn medical terminology, anatomy, insurance systems, and coding protocols. The workload is significant, and not everyone who starts will finish. But those who do will have skills that are genuinely valuable in the job market." She let that sink in, her gaze moving across each of us. "I don't do participation trophies or false encouragement. You'll get honest feedback, and you'll be expected to meet high standards. If that sounds like too much, now is the time to leave." No one moved. Rachel nodded, apparently satisfied, and launched into the first lesson. Medical terminology, she explained, was the foundation of everything else. Without fluency in the language of medicine, coding was impossible. She started with prefixes and suffixes, breaking down complex words into understandable components. Cardio meant heart. Ology meant study of. Pathy meant disease. Simple enough on the surface, but she quickly escalated to combinations that required real concentration. Cardiomyopathy, gastroenteritis, encephalopathy, each term built on previous knowledge, requiring both memorization and comprehension. I filled pages with notes, my hand cramping from the speed of writing. Around me, other students did the same, some typing on laptops, others using tablets with styluses. Rachel moved through material at a pace that felt relentless, pausing only briefly to answer questions before pushing forward. By the time she called for a break at 7:30, my brain felt overloaded, stuffed with information that hadn't quite settled into understanding. During the break, I grabbed coffee from the machine in the hallway, the liquid bitter and lukewarm but providing necessary caffeine. A woman about my age approached, introducing herself as Jennifer. "This is intense," she said, laughing nervously. I thought I was prepared, but wow. I agreed, grateful for the camaraderie. Jennifer worked as a pharmacy technician and was looking to transition into coding for better pay and hours. She had 2 kids at home and a husband who was managing bedtime routines while she attended class. The mention of her support system made something twist in my chest, a reminder of what I lacked, but I pushed it aside. Comparison was pointless. The second half of class focused on anatomy, specifically the cardiovascular system. Rachel used diagrams and models, pointing out structures and explaining their functions with the kind of detail that suggested she could have been a medical professional in another life. The heart's four chambers, the pathways of blood flow, the difference between arteries and veins. She quizzed us randomly, calling on students to identify structures or explain processes, and I felt my anxiety spike each time, terrified of being wrong in front of everyone. But when she called on me, asking about the function of the pulmonary artery, I managed to answer correctly, and her nod of approval felt like winning something significant. Class ended at 9, and I hurried to catch the bus home, my head spinning with medical terms and anatomical details. The apartment was dark when I arrived, Lily asleep in her bed, and Miss Angela dozing on the couch. She'd agreed to watch Lily on class nights in exchange for reduced daycare fees, an arrangement that benefited both of us. I woke her gently, thanking her profusely, and she left with a sleepy smile and reassurance that Lily had been fine. I checked on Lily, brushing hair from her forehead and adjusting her blanket, then collapsed at the kitchen table with my notes. The online modules Rachel had mentioned were accessible through a portal, and I logged in to find the first assignments already posted. Read chapters 1 through 3 of the textbook. Complete the terminology quiz. Watch the anatomy video series. Each task came with a deadline, and I calculated how much time I'd need versus how much time I actually had. The math was daunting, but I'd committed to this path. There was no turning back now. The following weeks established a rhythm that was exhausting but manageable. Mornings with Lily, making breakfast and walking her to daycare. Days spent on online modules and assignments, working from the library because the Wi-Fi was faster, and the environment more conducive to concentration than my cramped apartment. Evenings split between class nights and the nights I stayed home with Lily, trying to be present for her while my mind churned through medical codes and insurance protocols. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't quite afford, measured in hours that never felt sufficient. Frank checked in regularly, texting to ask how the program was going and offering encouragement when I admitted to struggling. Rachel was true to her word about honest feedback, marking assignments with detailed notes about what I'd gotten wrong and how to improve. Her standards were high, and I found myself working harder than I ever had at anything, driven by the knowledge that this was my chance, possibly my only chance, to build something better. The other students became familiar faces, friendly if not quite friends. Jennifer and I studied together sometimes, quizzing each other on terminology over coffee at the library. She talked about her kids and her husband, the logistics of managing family life while pursuing advancement, and I listened with a kind of wistful envy. Her challenges were real, but they played out within a framework of support I'd never had. Still, I appreciated her company. The way commiserating about difficult assignments made them feel slightly less overwhelming. By mid-May, we'd moved into actual coding practice, applying the terminology and anatomy we'd learned to real medical records. Rachel provided redacted patient files and had us assign the appropriate codes, then went through each case in class, explaining where we'd gone right or wrong. The work required intense focus, translating complex medical information into standardized codes that insurance companies would accept. A single-digit error could mean a claim denial, which meant the provider didn't get paid, which meant understanding the stakes of accuracy. I discovered I was good at it. Not naturally, not without effort, but I had the kind of detail-oriented mind that thrived on systematic processes. Where some students struggled with the precision required, I found it satisfying, almost meditative. The codes followed rules, and rules could be learned and applied consistently. Rachel noticed, commenting after class one evening, that my accuracy had improved significantly. "You have a knack for this," she said, and the compliment sustained me through the next week of particularly challenging assignments. Lily's 5th birthday arrived in late May, and I wanted desperately to make it special despite our limited resources. I'd saved small amounts from the unemployment benefits, setting aside money for a cake and a few modest presents. We celebrated at the apartment, just the two of us, with homemade decorations and the chocolate cake she loved. She blew out the candles with fierce concentration, making a wish she refused to share, and opened her gifts with delight that felt disproportionate to their monetary value. A set of art supplies from the discount store. A picture book I'd found at a used bookshop. A stuffed animal that was soft and exactly the right size for cuddling. Watching her happiness, I felt the absence of extended family more acutely than usual. This should have been the kind of event where grandparents sent cards and gifts, where relatives gathered to celebrate another year of life. But there was no card from Victoria, no acknowledgement that her granddaughter had reached a milestone. The silence was expected but still painful. A reminder that we existed outside the family structure I'd grown up taking for granted. After Lily was asleep that night, I allowed myself a moment of anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, settled variety that came from years of accumulated disappointments. Victoria had chosen her reputation, her social standing, her place among Boston's elite over any relationship with me or Lily. That choice had consequences, and one day she'd understand what she'd missed. I didn't know when or how, but I believed it with a certainty that felt almost prophetic. The life I was building, the person I was becoming through sheer determination, would eventually demonstrate just how wrong she'd been about me. June brought the halfway point of the certification program and a shift in focus. We'd mastered the basics and were now learning specialty coding for different medical fields. Orthopedics, cardiology, gastroenterology, each with its own nuances and complexities. Rachel pushed us harder, assigning more cases and expecting faster turnaround times. The pressure intensified and several students dropped out, deciding the workload was unsustainable. Jennifer confessed one evening that she was considering leaving too, that balancing the program with family obligations was destroying her marriage. I listened and offered what support I could, but privately I felt a kind of grim determination. I couldn't quit. There was nothing to quit to, no backup plan or safety net. This program was the bridge to a different life, and burning it meant staying trapped in circumstances that were slowly suffocating me. So while others wrestled with the decision to continue or withdraw, I just kept working, kept showing up, kept pushing through exhaustion and doubt. By July, we were down to 10 students from the original 15. The ones who remained had formed a tight bond, united by shared struggle and the growing sense that we might actually finish. Rachel seemed pleased with our persistence, occasionally showing flashes of warmth beneath her stern exterior. She brought snacks to class sometimes, practical things like granola bars and fruit, and made sure we took breaks even when the material felt urgent. Small gestures, but they mattered. My unemployment benefits were running low, the calculations I'd made at the beginning of the program proving optimistic. I'd cut every possible expense, living on pasta and rice, buying clothes only when something became literally unwearable, walking instead of taking the bus whenever possible. But money still disappeared faster than it arrived. And by mid-July I was facing the reality that I might not make it to the program's end in September without additional income. Frank, when I confided this, suggested freelance medical billing. You've got the skills and there are always providers looking for contract help. It won't be much, but it might bridge the gap. He connected me with several small practices that needed part-time billing support, work I could do remotely on my own schedule. The pay was modest but immediate, and I threw myself into it during the hours Lily was at daycare and I wasn't in class or studying. It meant even less sleep, more caffeine, days that blurred together into an endless cycle of work and study and childcare. But it also meant we'd survive until certification. August arrived with heat that made the apartment unbearable and a growing sense that the finish line was actually impossibly within reach. The final module of the program focused on professional practice, the business side of medical coding. How to work with providers, how to handle claim denials, how to stay current with constantly changing regulations. Rachel brought in guest speakers, working coders who shared their experiences and answered questions. One woman talked about starting her own coding business, contracting with multiple providers and earning significantly more than she ever had as an employee. The possibility felt distant but not entirely fantastical, a future I could maybe someday imagine for myself. The certification exam was scheduled for early September, and Rachel devoted the final weeks to exam preparation. Practice tests, time drills, review sessions that covered everything we'd learned over the past 5 months. My scores on the practice tests were consistently high, usually in the 90th percentile, and Rachel noted that I was on track to pass the actual exam comfortably. But I couldn't shake the anxiety, the fear that I'd get to the test and suddenly forget everything, that all this work would amount to nothing. Lily started kindergarten in September, a transition that was both exciting and terrifying. She was ready, more than ready, eager to join the big kids and learn to read and make new friends. But it meant navigating a new schedule, a new school, new logistics that had to be figured out and coordinated. The school was further from our apartment than the daycare had been, requiring a longer walk in the morning, and the hours didn't quite align with my certification class schedule. Miss Angela agreed to help with pickup on class nights, another kindness I'd someday have to repay. The certification exam took place on a Saturday in mid-September, administered at a testing center downtown. I arrived early, my stomach churning with nerves, and checked in with hands that trembled slightly. The exam was computer-based, for hours of multiple-choice questions covering everything from anatomy to coding protocols to professional ethics. I moved through it methodically, reading each question carefully, eliminating obviously wrong answers before selecting my choice. Some questions were straightforward, direct applications of knowledge I'd memorized. Others required deeper analysis, scenario-based problems that tested whether I truly understood the underlying concepts. When I submitted the final answer and the screen went blank, I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. The results wouldn't be available for several weeks, sent by mail to avoid the anxiety of immediate digital notification. Now there was nothing to do but wait and hope that 5 months of intensive work had been enough. Jennifer texted that evening to compare experiences, both of us admitting to uncertainty about how we'd performed. Rachel sent a group message to all of us who'd taken the exam, congratulating us on reaching this point regardless of the outcome. You've already proven you have what it takes by finishing the program. The exam is just formal recognition of what I already know to be true. Her confidence felt generous, possibly unearned, but I wanted to believe her. September stretched into early October, each day marked by checking the mail with a mixture of hope and dread. Lily settled into kindergarten beautifully, coming home each afternoon with stories about her teacher and new friends and the things she was learning. I'd found more freelance billing work, enough to pay rent and groceries and start slowly chipping away at the credit card debt that had accumulated. Life had achieved a precarious stability, better than it had been but still fragile enough that one crisis could topple everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, nondescript and official looking, from the certification board. I stared at it for a long moment before opening, suddenly terrified of disappointment. But when I finally tore it open and unfolded the letter inside, the first words were congratulations. I'd passed. Not just passed, but scored in the 94th percentile, high enough to qualify for specialty certifications if I chose to pursue them later. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy, and I had to sit down on the building's front steps, clutching the letter like it might dissolve if I let go. I called Rachel first, my voice shaking as I thanked her for everything. She accepted the gratitude with characteristic brevity. You did the work, Amanda. I just provided the structure. Now go use those skills. I promised I would, already mentally composing the resume I'd send to hospitals and medical practices throughout Boston. Jennifer called an hour later with her own good news. She'd passed too, and we celebrated over the phone like the friends we'd become, sharing excitement and relief in equal measure. That evening I took Lily out for ice cream, a small celebration she didn't fully understand but enjoyed immensely. We sat at a sticky table in the shop near our apartment, eating sundaes that were probably too large, and I tried to explain what the certification meant. It means Mama can get a better job, sweetie. One that pays more money so we can have nice things and not worry so much. Lily nodded seriously, then returned her attention to the ice cream, and I smiled at her priorities. She'd understand eventually, when stability became normal instead of extraordinary. Over the following weeks, I applied to dozens of positions, targeting hospitals and large medical practices that offered good salaries and benefits. The responses came quickly, my certification and the high exam score apparently making me a competitive candidate. I had phone interviews, then in-person interviews, each one requiring me to project confidence and competence I was still learning to feel genuinely. But I'd gotten good at performing capability, at presenting the version of myself I was growing into rather than the one I'd been. In late October, I received a job offer from Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical centers in Boston. The position was in their central billing department, coding for multiple specialties, with a starting salary of $68,000. The number felt surreal, more than triple what I'd earned at the medical billing job Karen had fired me from. Benefits included health insurance, retirement contributions, and generous paid time off. I accepted immediately, hardly believing this was real, that I'd actually climbed out of the hole that had felt inescapable. My start date was set for November 1st, giving me 2 weeks to prepare. I bought professional clothes at a consignment shop, blouses and slacks that fit properly and looked appropriate for a hospital setting. I arranged for Lily's after-school care, finding a program that fit within my new budget without strain. I moved through these preparations with a sense of surreal accomplishment, each task a reminder that life was actually fundamentally changing. Frank took me to lunch on my last day of freelance work, insisting on celebrating even though I protested the expense. We ate at a diner near the library, and he asked about my plans with the genuine interest of someone who'd invested in my success. I'm going to work hard, prove myself, maybe pursue specialty certifications eventually, and I'm going to make sure Lily has everything she needs, that she never doubts she's wanted and valued. Frank nodded approvingly. That's good. Real good. Then, more quietly, he added, you proved a lot of people wrong, you know? Including yourself, probably. The observation hit harder than expected, and I had to blink back sudden tears. He was right. I'd spent so long internalizing Victoria's disappointment, accepting her assessment that I was a failure who'd thrown away every opportunity, that I'd stopped believing anything different was possible. But here I was, certified and employed and building a life that didn't require anyone's approval or support. The vindication felt sweet but also bittersweet, tinged with grief for the years I'd wasted believing I wasn't capable. My first day at Mass General was overwhelming in the best way. The building was enormous, a maze of departments and specialties, and my supervisor spent the morning orienting me to the coding department's systems and workflows. My coworkers were friendly, welcoming me to the team with genuine warmth, and the work itself was engaging, challenging in ways that felt stimulating rather than defeating. I coded cases throughout the day, consulting reference materials when needed, and felt a quiet satisfaction each time I completed a file correctly. The paycheck from that first month changed everything. After paying rent and utilities and groceries and childcare, I actually had money left over. Not a fortune, but enough to start rebuilding savings, to buy Lily new clothes that fit properly, to occasionally splurge on takeout instead of cooking. The constant background anxiety about money didn't disappear immediately, but it eased, loosening its grip on my daily thoughts. By December, Lily and I had settled into a routine that felt genuinely sustainable. School drop-off, work, pick up from the after-school program, evenings together that didn't involve frantic scrambling to make ends meet. I'd started paying down the credit card debt systematically, watching the balances shrink with each payment. Small victories, but they accumulated into something that looked like stability. Victoria's annual spring gala invitations went out in January, arriving in mailboxes throughout Beacon Hill and beyond. Mine arrived by some clerical error or perhaps cruel joke, forwarded from an old address to my Dorchester apartment. I stared at the heavy cardstock, embossed with elegant script, inviting me to the Fairmont Copley Plaza for an evening of philanthropy benefiting Boston Medical Center. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria raising money for the same hospital system where I now worked, where I'd built a career from nothing. I'd planned to throw the invitation away, to ignore it like I'd ignored everything related to Victoria for the past several years. But something made me hesitate. An idea, audacious and probably inadvisable, began forming. What if I attended? Not as the prodigal daughter begging for acceptance, but as a successful professional who'd built a life Victoria had never believed possible. What if I showed her, and all her high society friends, exactly what I'd become despite her rejection? The decision crystallized over the following weeks. I would go to the gala. I would walk into that ballroom in the Fairmont Copley Plaza wearing professional confidence like armor. And I would make sure Victoria understood the cost of her choices, not through confrontation or drama, but through simple presence, through existing as living proof that her assessment of my worth had been catastrophically wrong. In February, Steven Harper reached out. He was a venture capitalist I'd met briefly at a hospital fundraiser, someone who invested in healthcare technology startups. We talked about the inefficiencies in medical billing systems, how much money was lost to coding errors and claim denials, and he'd seemed interested in my perspective as someone who worked in the trenches. His email was direct, asking if I'd be willing to consult on a healthcare app his firm was developing, something that would help smaller practices improve their billing accuracy. The pay he offered for consultation was generous, and the project sounded genuinely interesting. I agreed, and over the next few months worked with his development team, providing input on features and workflows that would actually be useful for medical coders. The app evolved from concept to prototype to something ready for beta testing, and my role expanded from consultant to advisor to, eventually, minority stakeholder. Steven offered me equity in the company, explaining that my expertise had been instrumental in creating something providers actually wanted to use. The percentage was small, just 2%, but if the company succeeded, even that small stake could be worth something significant. By March, the app had launched and was gaining traction faster than anyone anticipated. Medical practices were adopting it enthusiastically, praising its intuitive design and practical functionality. Revenue grew, and with it the company's valuation. Steven called one evening with news that a major healthcare corporation wanted to acquire the platform. The offer was substantial, $340 million, and if I agreed to the sale, my 2% stake would be worth nearly $7 million. I sat in my apartment, the same cramped space I'd lived in for years, and tried to process what he was telling me. $7 million. Generational wealth. The kind of money that would mean Lily never had to struggle the way I had. That would fund her education and mine. That would provide security I'd never imagined possible. I agreed to the sale without hesitation, and Steven promised to handle the legal details. The acquisition closed in early April, and the money appeared in my bank account like something from a dream. I stared at the balance, the string of digits that seemed impossible, and felt a kind of calm certainty settle over me. This was it. This was the moment I'd been building toward. Probably without even realizing it. Not just financial success, though that mattered, but proof that I'd taken every obstacle Victoria had placed in my path and transformed them into stepping stones towards something she'd never anticipated. The spring gala was scheduled for late April, the invitation still sitting on my kitchen counter where I'd left it months ago. I bought a dress for the occasion, something elegant but not ostentatious, paired with jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother before Victoria had cut me off. I arranged for Miss Angela to watch Lily for the evening, explaining that I had an important event to attend but not elaborating on what it was. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, styling my hair and applying makeup with more attention than I usually bothered with. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked dramatically different, but because the person staring back carried herself with a confidence that had been earned through years of struggle and triumph. This wasn't the daughter Victoria had rejected. This was someone entirely new, forged through adversity into something stronger than privilege could ever create. I took a taxi to the Fairmont Copley Plaza, unwilling to arrive on public transportation, and walked into the grand ballroom with my head high. The space was exactly as I remembered from childhood events Victoria had dragged me to. All crystal chandeliers and gilded details and people dripping in wealth they'd inherited rather than earned. I spotted Victoria almost immediately, holding court near the silent auction tables, surrounded by her usual circle of society matrons and philanthropists. For a moment, I considered approaching her directly, forcing a confrontation she couldn't avoid. But something better occurred to me. I'd wait. Let the evening unfold naturally. Let her see me first, let the shock register, and then respond on my terms. So I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and began circulating through the crowd, greeting people I vaguely remembered from my childhood, answering questions about what I'd been doing with vague references to healthcare technology and recent business success. The announcement came during dinner, a presentation about the gala's charitable impact, and the major donors who'd made it possible. Victoria stood at the podium, radiant in a gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and thanked everyone for their generosity. Then the screen behind her lit up with news coverage, and I saw my own face staring back from a business article. Local healthcare app acquired for $340 million. The subtitle identified me by name, Amanda Collins, as one of the key developers and a major stakeholder in the sale. The room erupted in murmurs, people checking their phones and whispering to their neighbors. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions, shock giving way to confusion, giving way to something that might have been recognition. She searched the crowd, and when her eyes finally landed on me, sitting calmly at a table near the back, she froze. Just for a moment, but long enough for me to see every emotion flash across her face. Disbelief. Embarrassment. The dawning realization that her daughter, the one she'd written off as a failure, had achieved something none of these people with their inherited wealth and social connections ever would. I raised my champagne glass slightly, a gesture that could have been a toast but felt more like a statement. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly before she recovered and continued her speech. But the damage was done. The people around me started making connections, realizing who I was and what my presence meant. Questions came in a rush. "You're Victoria's daughter? We thought you were abroad? What have you been doing? When did you develop this app?" I answered with gracious brevity, not elaborating unnecessarily but not hiding either. I'd been working in medical billing, recognized inefficiencies in the system, and helped develop a solution. The success had been unexpected but gratifying. Yes, Victoria was my mother, though we hadn't been close in recent years. No, I hadn't been abroad. I'd been right here in Boston, building a career and raising my daughter. The revelation rippled through the room, and I watched Victoria try to manage the social fallout. Her friends, the ones who'd believed whatever story she'd told about my absence, now knew the truth, or at least enough of it to make their own conclusions. She'd hidden me, been ashamed of me, while I'd been accomplishing something genuinely impressive. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Victoria approached me after dinner, her expression carefully controlled. "Amanda, can we talk privately?" I considered refusing, letting her feel the weight of public awkwardness, but decided against it. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about closure, about finally standing on equal ground. I followed her to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from curious ears. She started with something that might have been an apology or an explanation, words tumbling out about difficult choices and not understanding and wanting to reconnect. I let her talk, watching her struggle to find language that would make her actions seem reasonable. When she finally ran out of words, I spoke quietly but firmly. "You chose your reputation over your daughter and granddaughter. You made that choice repeatedly for years. I've built a life without you, and Lily has grown up not knowing her grandmother. You can't undo that damage with an apology at a gala." Victoria's face crumpled slightly, and for the first time I saw genuine regret. But regret wasn't enough. It didn't erase the nights I'd cried myself to sleep wondering why I wasn't worth loving. It didn't give Lily back the grandmother who should have been present for birthdays and milestones. It just was a feeling Victoria would have to carry, just as I'd carried the weight of her rejection. "If you want to meet Lily someday, you can reach out. But it will be on my terms, in my home, respecting the boundaries I set. You don't get to swoop in now that success makes me palatable to your social circle." I left before she could respond, walking out of the Fairmont Copley Plaza into the spring night. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the promise of summer, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because Victoria had apologized, though that had happened, but because I'd proven to myself and to her, and to everyone in that ballroom, that worth wasn't determined by birth or connections or approval. It was built through persistence and skill and refusing to accept other people's limitations as truth. The taxi ride home took me through familiar streets, past the neighborhoods I'd navigated for years while struggling to survive, past the medical billing office where Karen had fired me, past the library where I'd studied for the certification exam, past the community center where Rachel had taught me skills that changed everything. Each landmark felt significant, part of a journey that had led here, to this moment of absolute certainty about who I was and what I'd accomplished. Miss Angela was dozing on my couch when I arrived home, and I woke her gently, thanking her as always. Lily was sleeping peacefully, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, and I stood in the doorway of her room just watching her breathe. This child, this miracle I'd raised alone through impossible circumstances, would never doubt her worth the way I doubted mine. She would grow up knowing that her mother had built something remarkable from nothing, that obstacles were challenges to overcome rather than limits to accept. I changed out of the gala dress and into comfortable clothes, making tea and sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop. Tomorrow I'd start planning what came next. Maybe more education, a master's degree in healthcare administration. Maybe philanthropy work, using some of the money to help other single mothers access the kind of training and support that had saved me. Maybe just rest, allowing myself to finally exhale after years of holding my breath. But tonight, I just sat in the quiet apartment, drinking tea and feeling the solid weight of achievement settle into my bones. I'd done it. Against every odd, despite every rejection, through sheer stubborn determination, I'd built a life worth living. And that, more than any dollar amount or social triumph, was the real victory. The morning after the gala, I woke to sunlight streaming through the apartment windows and the sound of Lily humming in her room. For a moment I lay still, processing the previous evening's events with the clarity that only distance and sleep could provide. Victoria's face when she'd seen the news coverage, the whispers rippling through the ballroom, the careful conversation afterward where I'd set boundaries she had no choice but to accept. It all felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else, but the dress hanging on my closet door confirmed the reality. Lily padded into my room, dragging her rabbit and asking for pancakes in that matter-of-fact way children had of prioritizing their immediate needs over adult complications. I pulled myself from bed and followed her to the kitchen, mixing batter while she chattered about a dream she'd had involving unicorns and a castle made of books. Her innocence, her ability to exist entirely in the present moment without the weight of past grievances or future anxieties, reminded me why I'd fought so hard to get here. Everything I'd endured, every humiliation and setback and moment of despair, had been for this. For mornings making pancakes in an apartment that was small but ours, with a daughter who felt secure enough to dream about magical creatures. My phone buzzed repeatedly throughout breakfast, messages from people I barely remembered asking to reconnect, to grab coffee, to discuss business opportunities. The sudden interest felt transparent, motivated by the news of the acquisition rather than genuine care about my well-being. I deleted most of the messages without responding, unwilling to let people back into my life simply because success had made me valuable in their eyes. The ones who'd mattered, Frank and Rachel and Miss Angela, had shown up when I had nothing to offer but struggle. They'd earned their place. These strangers asking for my time had not. Rachel called mid-morning, her voice carrying the same no-nonsense tone I'd grown accustomed to during the certification program. Saw the news coverage. Impressive work. I thanked her, trying to deflect credit, but she cut me off. Don't minimize what you've accomplished, Amanda. You identified a problem, developed expertise, and created a solution. That's entrepreneurship. Own it. Her words settled something in me. Permission I hadn't realized I needed to actually claim my success without qualifying it with luck or timing or anything that diminished the effort involved. She continued, explaining that she wanted to expand her training program and was looking for funding from people who understood the value of education as a pathway out of poverty. Would I be interested in becoming a major donor, possibly joining the board of directors? The opportunity felt right in a way few things had. A chance to directly impact others facing the same barriers I'd encountered. I agreed immediately, and we scheduled a meeting to discuss specifics. Hanging up, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement, extending into something that might actually make systemic difference. Frank texted in the afternoon with characteristic brevity. Proud of you. Knew you had it in you. Then after a pause, beer sometime? My treat. I smiled at the phone at his continued refusal to make a big deal out of anything, and confirmed we'd set something up soon. His steady presence throughout the past year had been invaluable, a reminder that support didn't require grand gestures or emotional intensity. Sometimes it was just showing up consistently, offering practical help, and believing in someone's potential, even when they couldn't quite believe it themselves. The weekend passed in a blur of normal activities made extraordinary by the knowledge of how dramatically circumstances had shifted. Grocery shopping without calculating every item's cost, buying Lily new shoes because she wanted them rather than because the old ones were literally falling apart, taking her to the Children's Museum without worrying about the admission fee. Small indulgences that represented enormous psychological freedom, the absence of constant financial anxiety creating space for actual enjoyment. Monday brought a call from Steven Harper, the investor who'd brought me into the app development project. He wanted to discuss future opportunities, other healthcare technology ventures where my expertise could be valuable. We met for lunch at a restaurant in the Seaport District, the kind of place where business deals happened over expensive seafood and wine. Steven arrived with another investor, a woman named Patricia who specialized in medical technology startups, and they pitched a new concept. A platform for patients to better understand their medical bills, breaking down charges in plain language and identifying potential errors. The idea resonated. Immediately, I'd seen countless patients struggle with incomprehensible billing statements, charges that made no sense and explanations that were deliberately obtuse. A tool that empowered patients to advocate for themselves could potentially save people thousands of dollars, while also improving the billing process for providers. I asked questions about the technical architecture, the business model, the regulatory considerations, and found myself genuinely excited about the possibility. By the end of lunch, I'd agreed to come on board as an advisor with another equity stake, smaller than the previous one but still meaningful. Walking back to my car afterward, I thought about how different this felt from the medical billing job I'd been fired from less than a year ago. Then I'd been powerless, subject to Karen's arbitrary standards and impossible expectations, with no control over my circumstances. Now I was being sought out for my expertise, treated as a valuable partner rather than an expendable employee. The transformation wasn't just financial. It was fundamental, a shift in how the world perceived me and how I perceived myself. Victoria called that evening, her voice tentative in a way I'd never heard before. Amanda, I know you said to reach out if I wanted to meet Lily, and I've been thinking about what you said at the gala. You're right. I made terrible choices, prioritized things that don't actually matter, and hurt you deeply in the process. I don't expect forgiveness, but I would like the chance to know my granddaughter, if you're willing to allow that. The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them multiple times before dialing, but the emotion beneath them seemed genuine. I didn't answer immediately, taking time to consider what I actually wanted rather than reacting from old wounds. Did I want Victoria in Lily's life? The question was more complicated than simple yes or no. Lily deserved to know her grandmother, to have extended family beyond just me. But that relationship would need boundaries, clear expectations about Victoria's role and limitations. I can't promise anything, I said finally, but we can start slowly. Maybe a supervised visit somewhere neutral and see how it goes. No pressure on Lily, no expectations that she'll immediately bond with you. And if you ever make her feel less than, if you show even a hint of the judgment you showed me, it ends immediately. Victoria agreed without hesitation, relief evident in her voice. We scheduled something for the following weekend. A visit to the park where Lily loved feeding the ducks. I'd be present the entire time, mediating interactions and protecting my daughter from any potential harm. It felt like a reasonable starting point, an opportunity for Victoria to demonstrate whether she'd actually changed, or whether this was just another performance motivated by social pressure. Preparing Lily for the visit required careful explanation. You're going to meet Grandma Victoria this weekend. She's my mother, but we haven't seen each other in a long time because we had some disagreements. I want you to meet her, but if you feel uncomfortable at any point, just tell me and we'll leave. Lily processed this with the seriousness children brought to new experiences, asking practical questions about whether Grandma Victoria liked ducks, and if she would bring treats. I assured her on both counts, making mental note to remind Victoria to bring duck food. The visit itself was awkward but not disastrous. Victoria arrived at the park dressed more casually than I'd ever seen her, clearly making an effort to seem approachable. She brought duck food as requested and a small stuffed animal for Lily, nothing extravagant but thoughtfully chosen. Lily accepted the gift with polite enthusiasm, studying Victoria with the kind of frank assessment children excelled at. You look like Mama, she observed, and Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. They fed the ducks together while I watched from a nearby bench, ready to intervene if necessary but allowing them space to interact naturally. Victoria asked questions about kindergarten and favorite colors, and the stuffed rabbit that Lily carried everywhere, and Lily answered with increasing comfort. By the end of the hour, they weren't exactly bonded, but the foundation for potential relationship had been established. Victoria hugged me goodbye, whispering thank you with such genuine gratitude that I almost felt sorry for her, for everything she'd missed by choosing pride over connection. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm, one that included occasional supervised visits with Victoria, but centered primarily on the life I'd built. Work at Mass General continued to be engaging, the coding challenges keeping my skills sharp, while the steady paycheck provided security. The consulting work with Steven's new venture added variety and intellectual stimulation, pulling me into strategic discussions about product development and market positioning. Rachel's training program welcomed me onto their advisory board, and I began working with her to expand scholarship opportunities for single parents. Lily flourished in kindergarten, making friends and learning to read with the kind of enthusiasm that made every parent-teacher conference a joy. Her teacher described her as bright and empathetic, quick to help classmates who struggled and creative in her approach to problems. Listening to these descriptions, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with business success or financial achievement. I'd raised a kind, confident child despite circumstances that could have broken both of us. That was the real victory. In June, I received an invitation to speak at a healthcare technology conference about the app that had been acquired. The organizers wanted me to discuss the development process and the importance of bringing practitioner expertise into technology design. Public speaking terrified me, but Rachel's voice echoed in my head, reminding me not to minimize my accomplishments. I accepted the invitation and spent weeks preparing, practicing my presentation until the words felt natural rather than memorized. The conference was held at a hotel in downtown Boston, attended by hundreds of healthcare professionals and technology entrepreneurs. I stood backstage waiting for my introduction, my heart hammering against my ribs, and thought about how far I'd come from the woman who'd sat in a cramped apartment wondering how she'd pay rent. When my name was called, I walked onto the stage with as much confidence as I could project and began speaking about identifying inefficiencies in medical billing systems, about the value of lived experience in solving complex problems, about the importance of creating technology that actually served users rather than just investors. The audience responded enthusiastically, asking thoughtful questions during the panel discussion that followed. Afterward, people approached to exchange business cards and discuss potential collaborations. One woman, a hospital administrator, told me my story had inspired her to rethink how her facility approached staff development and internal innovation. The comment stayed with me long after the conference ended, a reminder that sharing my journey might help others see possibilities they'd overlooked in their own circumstances. Summer brought a decision I'd been avoiding. The Dorchester apartment, the place that had sheltered us through the hardest years, no longer fit our needs or our financial reality. Lily deserved a bedroom that wasn't also mine. A yard to play in, neighbors who weren't separated by paper-thin walls. I started looking at houses in neighborhoods I'd never imagined affording, places with good schools and tree-lined streets and the kind of stability I'd always associated with people like Victoria. We found a house in Jamaica Plain, a modest 3-bedroom with a small backyard and a porch perfect for summer evenings. The mortgage payment was less than what I'd once struggled to pay in rent, and the thought of owning rather than renting felt revolutionary. Lily was ecstatic about having her own room, already planning how she'd decorate and where her toys would go. Moving day was chaotic but joyful, Frank and Rachel both showing up to help carry boxes and assemble furniture, turning what could have been stressful into something approaching celebration. Victoria asked to visit the new house, and I agreed with the same careful boundaries I'd maintained since our reconciliation began. She arrived with a housewarming gift, a framed photograph of me as a child that I'd never seen before, and we sat on the porch drinking iced tea while Lily played in the yard. Our conversations had become easier over time, less fraught with unspoken tension, though certain topics remained off limits. We'd never discussed in detail the years she'd cut me off, the damage that had caused, the ways it had shaped me. Maybe someday we would. Or maybe we'd just move forward, building something new rather than excavating everything broken in the past. By autumn, life had settled into a pattern that felt genuinely sustainable and satisfying. Work, family, community involvement through Rachel's program, occasional consulting projects that kept me engaged with innovation in healthcare technology. I'd paid off all my debt, established substantial savings, and started a college fund for Lily that would ensure she never faced the financial barriers I had. The money from the acquisition sat mostly untouched, too much to spend frivolously but available for security and opportunity and generosity toward causes that mattered. One evening in late October after Lily was asleep, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill, and thought about the journey that had led here. About waking to find a note of abandonment, about the terror of realizing I was truly alone, about the grinding poverty and exhaustion that had defined entire years, about Frank's quiet kindness and Rachel's demanding standards and Miss Angela's patient support, about Karen firing me and the certification exam and the app development that had changed everything, about Victoria's rejection and eventual, tentative return. All of it had been necessary, I realized. Not in some cosmic sense where suffering was virtuous or instructive, but in the practical sense that each experience had taught me something essential about resilience and resourcefulness, and refusing to accept other people's limitations as truth. I wouldn't choose to repeat any of it, wouldn't wish those struggles on anyone. But I also couldn't regret the person those experiences had forged me into. Someone who knew her worth wasn't determined by approval or inheritance, or anything external to her own effort and integrity. My phone buzzed with a text from Steven about another potential project, something involving artificial intelligence and diagnostic coding. I'd look at it tomorrow, I decided, give it the consideration it deserved. But tonight was for sitting in the quiet darkness, listening to the neighborhood sounds, feeling the solid presence of a house I owned and the sleeping child I'd raised, and the life I'd built from absolutely nothing. This was enough. More than enough. This was everything I'd fought for, and everything I'd never quite believed possible until it became real. The stars were visible above the city lights, scattered across the autumn sky, and I watched them until the cold drove me inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, the ongoing work of building and maintaining and improving. But tonight, I let myself simply rest in the knowledge that I'd made it, that Lily and I were safe and secure, and surrounded by people who valued us for who we actually were. That was the real success, the measure that mattered more than any dollar amount or professional achievement. We'd survived and then we'd thrived, and the life stretching ahead held possibilities I was finally ready to embrace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.